This is the Infotagion podcast, the vaccine to the disinformation virus. Questions of how we tackle disinformation, make tech companies more responsible for harmful content on their platforms, and protect people's data rights in an open web, have led to calls for a new international agreement to help create a consistent approach to managing these issues. In response to this, the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania launched its Transatlantic High-Level Working Group on Content Moderation and Online Freedom of Expression, bringing together leading writers, academics, and public policy experts from North America and Europe, including myself. Their first report was published in June this year. I'm Damian Collins, and I'll be joined on this Infotagion podcast by two leading members of that working group. Susan Ness was a commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission of the United States from 1994 to 2001 and is a distinguished fellow at the Annenberg Center, and Jeff Jarvis, an author and advocate for the open web and professor for journalism at the City University of New York. Susan and Jeff, it's fantastic to have you with us on the Infotagion podcast. Throughout the series, we've been interested to talk to people that are looking at the issue of content moderation and regulation for social media, because that seems to be a recurring theme when we think about how we tackle issues like disinformation and hate speech and other forms of harmful content on social media. Now, the Transatlantic Working Group has just published its report looking at the issue of content moderation online and freedom of expression. It's a really excellent report produced by a very knowledgeable group of people. Susan, perhaps you could tell us a little bit first off about how the working group was set up and how this project started.
My pleasure, Damian. Thank you so very much for inviting us to be on the podcast with you. The Transatlantic Working Group is a project of the Annenberg Public Policy Center, which is at the University of Pennsylvania. And we work in partnership with the Institution for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam, as well as the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands. And we had a grant from the Netherlands Embassy in the United States. The working group includes legislators like yourself, government officials, tech execs, civil society leaders, and academics. They were drawn equally from Europe and from North America. And I can assure you this group embraces a wide spectrum of views. After the 2016 election, we began to see a flurry of laws proposed in Europe and elsewhere around the globe to eliminate problematic content online. But many of these laws, we found, chilled speech and ignored due process of law. They required rapid takedown of problematic speech, sometimes within a day or an hour, without a court order. And they essentially deputized private companies to decide the legality of users' uploaded speech, with severe consequences to the platform if it failed to act. That incented platforms, therefore, to err on the side of deleting legal content, which thwarted freedom of expression, which in both Europe and the United States and Canada is a right that is fundamental and core to democracy. We also found that authoritarian leaders were citing these rules that were being developed in democracies to justify their own laws that were actually designed to quell dissent. Now, in the United States, there were conversations percolating, but there was little communication across the Atlantic on the best way for democracies to protect their citizens without damaging democracy in the process. And it was clear to a group of us that if democracies couldn't define a coherent set of principles and governance frameworks for online expression, other political powers with very different views and values would fill that void. So we formed the group to recommend practical solutions to curtail hate speech, violent extremism, and disinformation online while protecting freedom of expression. We tried to create a path forward that would be evidence-based and well-grounded in law, technology, and business, We knew that by working together across the Atlantic, and that was pretty unique about our group, we would tap the best ideas and ideally avoid conflicting laws. So that was basically the nature of the group.
I mean, did you find, the report says quite clearly that it's not based on unanimity, but nevertheless is informed by all of the discussions and meetings that were had. I mean, do you feel you could get a good consensus from people that come from very different legal traditions and from countries who approach this problem in different ways?
We believe we did. What was fundamental to our conclusion, basically, was a very flexible framework that could be developed in different countries in different ways that provided a baseline of regulatory authority that then could be enforced within various nations in different ways, potentially with a regulator, potentially with an industry association, for example, that was empowered to draft specific rules and do the evaluations. Or it could be a multi-stakeholder group that would provide that service. So we made it sufficiently flexible to be adaptable to different constituencies in different countries.
But, I mean, do you think it's fair to say that at the heart of the recommendations that you're making is, well, firstly, that there has to be a system of regulation for social media, and that this cannot be left to the tech companies to do by themselves? Would you agree with that?
I think the group concluded that that was the case. But once again, it would be on a flexible basis. I don't think we were looking at, we were not coming together to say it has to be one regulator in this format, looking at the wide expanse of issues facing online platforms. It was very definitely focused on online communication because that was the concern with respect to freedom of expression. We did not deal with privacy law. We did not deal with antitrust or competition law. It was really just focused on the very sensitive area of communication among people.
And I think I think that is a really important approach. And the report makes, I think, very good recommendations about allowing academics and civil society groups the right to audit what has happened if there's been an issue that's harmful content that's not been acted on, that social media companies should open themselves up to that sort of scrutiny. And indeed, I mean, universities have been calling for that for very many years. But in this model that's been advocated by the report, if there is a role then for independent oversight and regulation, what do you think? What's your view on what you do if the tech companies don't want to comply with that?
I think the concept was that it would be iterative. We would initially see the oversight on the largest companies, and the idea was to provide transparency with accountability, and I want to underscore transparency. It has actually different purposes, and this is something that I want to emphasize. It enables the governments to develop evidence-based policies for platform oversight. So this is important. If you have companies that are not complying with that, that could be part of the cycle to address. Sometimes these are smaller companies that don't have the resources to comply, or maybe they don't wish to comply. But transparency also pushes companies to examine problems that they would not otherwise particularly care to address. And that's also important for the public. And it also empowers citizens to better control their information environment. So we saw transparency as a way to get everyone engaged in better controlling the environment that they live in, as well as hopefully significantly reducing the level of hate speech, disinformation, and violence online.
I mean, as always, events can often drive this sort of process, which is why I think it's so important that the work is done to try and think of what these frameworks should be, rather than these frameworks being shaped out of an event. But many of the remarks you made at the beginning about different countries adopting different laws have often been in response to events. So Australia's legislation on requiring companies to remove violent content came following the Christchurch terrorist attack. And of course, we're seeing a really big debate opening up now in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic about the role of anti-vaccine campaigns, the role of disinformation leading to people committing arson attacks on mobile phone masts because they've been persuaded that 5G signals are causing coronavirus. And it gets us into this very difficult territory around the line between people's right to free expression and the harm that freedom of expression can cause other people. And Jeff, I wanted to bring you in to ask you about your views about this. Something we've discussed and not always agreed on in the past. But I mean, how do you think we deal with, say, the looming problem of trying to persuade people to take a coronavirus vaccine when we've got one, against what will probably almost certainly be a very aggressive campaign mounted by the anti-vaccine movement trying to persuade people not to take it?
Thanks for having me, Damian. And yes, the discussion that we have, I think, is important to try to figure out how to do this. And I come at this a great believer in the American First Amendment and freedom of expression, but I was impressed with what Susan was able to bring together in a consensus to say that rather than trying to put government in a position to regulate speech, which I'm always going to consider to be dangerous, instead to hold the platforms accountable for the promises that they make, and to do that through transparency. I recently reread John Milton's Areopagitica, and I think it illuminates the process that we're going through now, just as England did with print back in the day, where there was an effort to license print to worry about unauthorized speech. And John Milton had a rousing cry to say that we have to recognize that part of this process is the public learning how to deal with what we would call bad speech, uninformative speech, disinformation. And that rather than setting up a star council of people who are going to judge everything that's written, that's not going to get us very far. A, because it's impossible, and B, because the real goal here is to prepare the public to make their own judgment and to enable and allow that to happen. So I do think the platforms have a role in trying to improve the public conversation, but I do not believe the government should be in a position of decreeing what is accurate or not, what is safe or not, and so on. And it's a losing game. So instead, if we enable researchers to get the data, to look at the impact of the platforms on the public conversation, and in turn, the government on the public conversation, we'll be in a better position to make, as Susan says, evidence-based judgments moving forward.
What's your view on the question of amplification? Which it seems to have been something on the Infotagion podcast that keeps on coming back up, which is that people have freedom of speech rights, but do they have the right to have their voice amplified on social media? And how does the social media algorithm determine which voices it will amplify? And is that process the process that can often lead to the spread of harmful content? If the algorithm favors more extreme content over more center ground, middle of the road opinion, because the more extreme content generates more of a reaction.
There is a right to speech. There's a right to speak. There is not a right to be amplified. And I think we see this exact same discussion occurring. I found this fascinating. I said this to Susan a couple of weeks ago. The entire discussion around content moderation that's been occurring around especially Facebook and Twitter has now broken out into the culture at large as we see this greater discussion about the so-called cancel culture. And what's happening in the so-called cancel culture debate is that people who've held the microphones for a long time tend to resent people coming along with new microphones to speak and who can criticize them and say that, well, we shouldn't be saying this or that anymore. And this is often dismissed as political correctness. It's dismissed as cancel culture. But what we really see happening at the end of the day is simply a negotiation of our norms around speech, about what we consider acceptable now. And that negotiation always occurs, but the difference is that there are more voices being heard in it. And so I think it's a healthy process, and I think I want to beware saying that this is entirely new, and it's simply a matter of choices. So the platforms have choices to make the same way, and I'm very cautious here. I do not consider the platforms media, but just as Kath Feiner, the editor of The Guardian, chooses who to put in The Guardian and who not to, so the platforms have a similar right of freedom of expression, that they can decide what to amplify and what not to. And I don't think that amplification is a bad influence of this discussion. It's something that occurs when an editor chooses to put something on the front page or inside or not at all. And it's something the platforms can decide whether to promote something or not.
Yes, I suppose, again, we come to these different systems, and I know the report references the sort of regulatory models that have been created for broadcast media and whether they're appropriate to read over into the online age. But a newspaper editor ultimately is accountable for the decisions that they make. And I suppose, for me, one of the questions here is, if a company uses its freedom and judgment to decide what it chooses to amplify, based, I suppose it might say, on what it thinks its customers are interested in, and the consequence of that is content that could be very harmful gets amplified, does the company bear some responsibility for the decision that it made?
Well, here I go to the wisdom, I believe, of Section 230 in the United States. It was perhaps the last wise thing the American Congress did when it said that if platforms, and whether that platform, by the way, is Facebook, or whether that platform is the comment section of the Telegraph, if platforms are held liable for everything that the public does on their platform, they're going to not allow the public to do anything on their platform, and we end up with a less robust public discussion at this moment, when the internet enables us finally as a democracy to have that robust discussion. So Section 230 gives any platform, again, which can be a publisher or it can be a technology company, the sword and the shield. It says that you will not be held liable for that which the public does on your platform, but you have the freedom to decide what should be on your platform and to get rid of that which you think is bad. And so thus you enable the public conversation, but you also, one would hope, would improve it. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in Section 230. It's being blamed now for bad things happening on the internet, but I really dread the Pandora box of 230 being opened up in the US, because I think that there's a lot of wisdom in recognizing the value of a public conversation, and that we will figure this out if given time.
I suppose the question I think we have is, does Section 230 give the companies a bit of an opt-out, where they get to say, well, we'll do what we can to address some of these issues around harmful content, but we'll do it in our way, in the way we want to, and ultimately there's no real liability for us if we don't go as far as other people want us to. And actually, looking at the tools again, the question, because I think if you were looking at certainly from a European perspective, if we had a kind of Ofcom style regulator for social media in the UK, I think if based on our broadcasting tradition, what you would see would be that there would be a code of conduct. The regulator wouldn't tell the companies what to do, but there's a code of conduct that it can mark them against and intervene if it thinks they're making wrong judgments. So the report that I think was published in the Wall Street Journal, looking at, I think it was based on a study of Facebook in Germany, which said that 64% of people that joined extremist groups on Facebook had done so at the recommendation of Facebook. I think a regulator could look at an issue like that and say, well, actually, that's wrong. No, that was irresponsible, and you shouldn't have allowed that to happen, and we want you to remedy that. And what I wonder as well, firstly, whether you would agree that that is something that would require remedy, and secondly, to you and Susan, if you think that there are cases where we think, well, we want them to behave in a different way, that ultimately is going to require some sort of regulatory body with certain powers in order to intervene, because otherwise it'll only ever be a recommendation which the companies can either heed or not.
If that's to me, I think that one presumption here, and I've mentioned it before, that's important, is that Ofcom regulates media where there are editors and producers who are held responsible. And we can debate about that as well, but we won't right now. But again, the platforms I want to emphasize, in my view, are not media. They are not packaged, edited, produced products. They are places where people get together to discuss. As I'm fond of saying, Twitter is not the New York Times, it's Times Square, at least in Times Square's glory days before the pandemic, where you could hear smart people and stupid people, and it was just conversation going on. And the hubris to think that we can edit the entirety of the public conversation, I think is itself dangerous. And I, again, will call for a rereading of John Milton and Areopagitica, but at a larger scale. Now, having said that, I believe, and I've been critical of Facebook here, I believe that the platforms should have a North Star. What Facebook has is a book of statutes that says you may not show naked breasts, or you may not use this word, or you may not do that. What it doesn't have is a constitution. And I believe that it should have that North Star. And this is me speaking, not the working group. And it should say, this is why Facebook exists. This is what it is here to do. This is what we accept and what we don't accept. And then, this is where the working group comes in, I think Facebook should be held responsible and accountable for whether or not it delivers on that promise. And it will fail at times. Of course it will. It's brand new. It's a difficult scale. I think what we're doing, the problem here is the discussion is occurring at the statutory level rather than the constitutional level. It's not occurring at the level of principles. And what I like about the working group's framework is it says, we can't determine every statute today. Let's have a framework for discussion. So when new things come up, when anti-vax comes up in the midst of a pandemic, we can have a discussion about what is appropriate, what should be done, and what we agree upon, and how to do that and how to measure that. The problem I have with much of the regulation to date, NetzDG law in Germany or the planned harms report in the UK, is that it thinks that it can define everything that's good or bad and can hold the platforms accountable for this. And that's not going to get us very far. I think instead it's more useful to have a framework for ongoing discussion about this. So yes, there are cases where I think the platforms, if they are acting responsibly, should say that we should get rid of QAnon, which Twitter just did. Hallelujah. But should the government be in a position where we say, aha, we declare that QAnon specifically is bad, you must get rid of it, or we're going to fine you a huge amount of your profit within 24 hours, that hasn't gotten us very far in Germany.
I mean, and Susan, where do you come out on the question of, does this need to be regulation or oversight backed up in statute, or can it be based on a voluntary code?
I think the framework needs enabling legislation, and I'm perfectly fine with that. Setting up basic concepts and then having some sort of an authority. As I mentioned, there are a variety of approaches for that would then basically oversee that the platforms are in fact enforcing their terms of service and community standards as they set forth. That would, as part of this review, include assessing the impact of the algorithms that the platforms use to make recommendation and prioritization decisions. Those are the decisions, basically, the curation portion that you were talking about before, that decides what content the users see in their feeds. I think there, once again, understanding what it is that the platform intends and whether, in fact, the algorithm delivers on that intention is an important piece of the puzzle. But then making sure that researchers that are well vetted so that we don't have issues, particularly with respect to privacy, that those researchers have the tools to go in and examine how all of this is working and to provide the evidence by which further iterations on, are we headed in the right direction? Are there issues? What needs to be done? And also, I want to underscore something that that Jeff had said. Basically, we are looking to platforms and others online and citizens to be good corporate citizens and to work together. We have a lot of problems that are online. There are a tremendous number of bad actors who are getting more and more sophisticated, particularly with respect to interference in elections, spreading false information about COVID and other types of bad behavior. We need to be able to get everyone to work together to stop that kind of behavior, to eliminate that kind of behavior. And it's not based on the content specifically, it's based on bad actors, it's based on bad behavior. And being able to track that behavior across platforms is extraordinarily important. And there we need everyone's cooperation and focus to get that done. Oftentimes you will see that it's not the biggest platforms, but some of the smaller ones that take a position that they're going to allow pretty much anything on their platform, whatever the behavior. And that is of concern, but most of the laws that we have seen are just addressing the biggest platforms and not really looking at some of the smaller entities. And that is something that needs to be worked through. Again, it could be on an iterative basis as we see what changes are being made and how those changes are impacting discourse online. So we see it as an iterative, cooperative process with a lot of pressure on the platforms to do what they say that they are willing to do, and to have researchers and the like examine what they are doing to make sure that that they are trying to fulfill their obligations. So that's the overall framework. And yes, we believe, or at least most of us believe, that that's a role for a legislation that provides the authority to do all of that. But then as soon as possible, taking it out of the hands of government. I served on the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, and I grew up with a very strong First Amendment background. But I am concerned when government dictates what can and cannot be said. And we see that happening with great impact around the globe right now. And so we have got to come up with a system that sets the concepts out there, makes it flexible, but then provides the ability for others to have the tools to do that examination. And the other thing we see in the United States, for example, if advertisers are not happy with where their advertisements are placed online, if there is bad content that they are very uncomfortable with, they protest, they take action, and that's what we're seeing happening against Facebook right now. We see the public putting pressure on platforms to label or otherwise determine if something is false, so that the public has an opportunity to know that there are other opinions out there. And that kind of fact-checking and labeling is something that can be encouraged and is being encouraged. I'd love to see legislation passed in the United States with respect to our advertisements for campaigns. Unfortunately, our Federal Election Commission is not in a position to do very much, notwithstanding our current election, which is a huge election, as everyone knows, coming up. But those kinds of rules, very specific and narrowly drawn, are appropriate. That having been said, overall, trying to do an overall general regulation can be extremely difficult and very easily begins to hamper freedom of expression and other human rights. And that's where we draw the line.
It's interesting with the current debate raging around advertising on Facebook and advertisers calling for Facebook to take a tougher stance on hate speech, that you may see this process driven not by government regulation, but by ad revenue. The companies, the
marketplace,
just taking decisions, say, well, okay, well, we're going to downgrade or remove this content because our advertisers tell us they want us to, rather than for any other particular reason. But before we close, you brought up the FCC, and I just wanted to ask about that. I was looking at an article about an old New York Times article written around the time of the creation of the FCC, and I thought it was quite interesting to look at what the objectives were, why President Roosevelt took this decision in 1933 to create the FCC, and inherent within it, I thought, as a British person reading this piece about American legislation, was that there was a recognition that radio in particular was a very, very powerful media, and therefore they wanted to make sure that American radio stations didn't come under foreign ownership, or there weren't you didn't have monopolies, that politicians were given equal right to access to radio, and that if radio accepted money from a political candidate to broadcast on it, they had to offer the same opportunity at the same price to another candidate as well. And all those things seem quite sensible. It creates a framework. It doesn't regulate speech, but it makes it an open and accessible media. And I just wonder if one of the problems that we face with social media is that it's become too easy to manipulate at scale by clever organizations who do that, and that they can try and manipulate the algorithm externally to make sure that one form of content gets a louder share of voice than another. And actually, it superficially looks like a platform that's all about free speech, but it's become too easy for certain areas of speech to crowd out others and make it much harder for people to get their message across.
That's why it's essential to have to build in that transparency with accountability, so that independent researchers can determine whether speech is being directed in a particular way or hampered, and publicize that information, make that information available to the public. If people want to be on a platform that is directing speech in a particular way, that's fine, but they need to know that that's what's going on. And so it's that transparency with accountability that respects First Amendment, or freedom of expression, but at the same time makes sure that the public, the users, know what that underlying purpose is. Jeff, did you have something to say on that?
I want to add in, if I may, there's no greater black box than the editorial floor of a newspaper, where decisions are made and you don't know what goes on. And there's an entire industry called public relations, which is designed to manipulate that. And it's their job to resist that manipulation. We see the same things at the platforms, that they have huge staffs to ferret out and resist the manipulation that occurs. I'm reminded of a book that I just reread from 1995 called Media at War, Radio's Challenge to the Newspapers, by Gwyneth Jackaway. And it tells a fascinating tale of the beginning of radio. And it was really, radio, when you think about it, was the first major competitor to print over 5 centuries. And print didn't like it. And so print tried to disadvantage radio. They tried to say that it was going to be that people couldn't listen and understand news alone. They had to read it. That these people were in radio were amateurs and they weren't very good. And they passed protectionist legislation, including, by the way, the FCC to an extent, and for a while forbade radio from carrying the news except that which they bought from newspapers, forbade them to make money on the news, and so on and so forth. But what happens in the long run is we figure it out. We are still in the early days of the internet. We're only 25 years away from the introduction of the commercial browser. And I think it's too soon to imagine that we know everything that's going on. It's more important, as Susan has said here, and as I've said, to figure out and this is with you, Damian, this is exactly what this podcast is about, and your participation in our group is to have this conversation. I don't think we have the answers today. And I think we need to see how things are being manipulated. The platforms, it's in their interest in most cases to tamp that down. In some cases, they will fail or they won't prioritize things enough. For that, we need discussion.
Absolutely. I think that's a good point on which to conclude for this podcast. And thank you, Jeff and Susan, so much for joining the discussion today. The report is a great read. I'd really recommend to all listeners that if you want to look at read a single report that gives a good summary of all of these issues, then this is a great place to start. But thank you both very much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Damian.
You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, and featuring Susan Ness and Jeff Jarvis. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom, and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thank you until next time.